The night sky over Moscow had always been a symbol of untouchable power, glittering light stretching across the Kremlin and Red Square. For decades, Russia's capital had projected strength, invulnerability, and command. But on this night, history would change forever. A piercing roar cut through the silence, the sound of Ukraine's newest and most advanced weapon, a missile that the world had only whispered about, but never seen in action. The missile streaked across the horizon, undetectable by Russia's aging radar systems. Ordinary Muscovites had no idea what was coming. Some were sipping tea by their windows, others rushing home after work, while children slept soundly in their apartments. And then, in one split second, the ground shook, glass shattered, alarms wailed, and Moscow itself was struck at its very core. This was not just another strike in a distant frontline village. This was the unimaginable. Ukraine had hit Moscow with a weapon powerful enough to send shockwaves across the globe. For the first time since the Second World War, the Russian heartland was burning. In Kyiv, the Ukrainian command center was silent for a few moments after launch. Generals and technicians stared at their monitors, watching the missile's trajectory. They had developed it in secret, with Western engineering support and Ukrainian ingenuity, something far beyond the systems previously seen in this war. It wasn't just about destruction, it was about sending a message. Nowhere is safe. President Volodymyr Zelensky, sitting in his underground bunker, received the encrypted confirmation. The missile had struck. His face, usually weary with the burden of leadership, now showed a mix of grim determination and relief. He whispered under his breath, "For every city you bombed, for every child you buried, this is justice." The Kremlin went into chaos. Sirens blared as Putin's security team rushed him deep into a fortified underground command center. He had been addressing advisors about Russia's inevitable victory just hours before. Now, his capital was hit, his credibility shaken. Ministers shouted over one another, demanding explanations. How could this happen? How could Moscow's vaunted defenses, the S-400 systems, the radar arrays, the missile interceptors, fail so catastrophically? The truth was brutal. Russia's systems were built for old wars, predictable wars. But Ukraine, fueled by desperation and innovation, had rewritten the rules. As dawn broke, the streets of Moscow were filled with smoke and disbelief. Civilians wandered in shock. Videos flooded social media. Burning government buildings, shattered glass on the streets, traffic frozen as thousands tried to flee. The once unshakable fortress of Russia had been pierced.
International reactions exploded within minutes. Washington, London, and Brussels released carefully worded statements, refusing to confirm direct involvement but praising Ukraine's remarkable defensive capabilities. NATO officials knew this was more than just a strike, it was a turning point. In Beijing, silence prevailed. China had invested heavily in keeping Moscow afloat diplomatically and economically. But this, an attack on the Russian capital, threatened to unravel everything. Chinese state media cautiously avoided the topic, while high-level advisors frantically drafted new strategies. But in the homes of ordinary Ukrainians, there was celebration. Families who had spent years in basements, who had buried loved ones under rubble, who had endured missile after missile raining down on their cities, now they saw justice. Across Kyiv, Lviv, Kharkiv, and Odessa, people lit candles, waved flags, and cried tears of pride and revenge. Social media filled with one phrase, "Moscow burns." For Ukrainians, it was not about cruelty. It was about balance. For every hospital struck, for every school destroyed, for every playground turned into a graveyard, Moscow now knew the pain. Putin, meanwhile, was cornered. His generals looked at him with fear, knowing the illusion of invulnerability had collapsed. Some whispered that escalation was the only answer, nuclear threats, cyberattacks, massive retaliation. But others, quieter, dared to suggest something unthinkable, negotiation. For years, Putin had projected an image of untouchable strength. But as intelligence reports piled on his desk, images of burning Moscow streets, intercepted Western communications confirming more missiles in Ukraine's arsenal, he realized he faced a nightmare. If Ukraine could hit Moscow once, it could do so again. And the people, his own people, would turn against him. In a rare moment of desperation, Putin requested a private call with mediators from Turkey and China. His voice, once booming with defiance, now trembled with carefully masked fear. He spoke of avoiding further bloodshed and seeking honorable peace. But everyone listening knew, this was not about peace. This was about survival. The myth of Russian invincibility had been shattered, and the world was watching. The Kremlin's walls trembled. For the first time since World War II, Moscow had felt the fiery punch of a missile no one thought Ukraine could ever deploy. It wasn't just any weapon. Western analysts soon identified it as a new generation precision missile, a system Ukraine had secretly tested in cooperation with its allies. Inside Moscow, the air was thick with panic. The sound of sirens echoed, people rushed to underground shelters, and social media feeds were flooded with chaotic videos, fiery explosions, smoke plumes rising over military sites, and terrified voices narrating what they were witnessing. The Russian state media tried to downplay the attack, claiming all incoming missiles were intercepted. But citizens themselves had filmed the burning wreckage of government buildings, proving the censorship false. Across the globe, leaders reacted instantly. NATO praised Ukraine's courage and resilience, while the European Union issued a joint statement calling the strike a turning point in the war. Meanwhile, China and India expressed deep concern, signaling that Russia was losing its last diplomatic lifelines. In the Kremlin bunker, Putin was furious. Reports showed that the missile had penetrated advanced S-400 air defense systems, long touted as impenetrable. Generals looked pale, shuffling papers, trying to offer explanations. But there was none. The strike had humiliated Russia before the entire world. Hours later, Putin addressed the nation. His voice shook, despite his attempt to remain firm. This is not an end, but if Ukraine continues these reckless acts, consequences will follow. Yet, behind the camera, he was reportedly desperate, even begging trusted aides to find a way out of the war. On the front lines, morale shifted dramatically. Ukrainian soldiers cheered, holding flags and chanting. They knew this was more than just a strike, this was proof that Moscow itself was no longer untouchable. Russian troops, in contrast, felt betrayed. If Moscow isn't safe, how can we survive here? One soldier messaged his family before deserting. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Zelensky declared, this war began with aggression from Moscow. Now, Moscow itself feels what it has unleashed. His words echoed globally, drawing thunderous applause in Western parliaments. Economic aftershocks followed instantly. The ruble collapsed overnight, international investors fled, and sanctions doubled. Long lines appeared outside banks in Russia, where citizens rushed to withdraw whatever was left of their savings. Supermarkets reported panic buying, shelves stripped bare. In Washington, the Pentagon released satellite images confirming the extent of the strike, a Russian military intelligence hub destroyed, communications blacked out, and several key generals missing. The symbolism was clear. Ukraine had not just hit Moscow, it had struck the very heart of Russian power. As night fell, Russian streets filled with whispers. Was this the end of the war, or the beginning of something much darker? Would Putin escalate with nuclear threats, or would he finally accept that Russia could no longer win? In private meetings, Russian oligarchs confronted Kremlin officials. Their fortunes were evaporating, their mansions abroad frozen, their families hiding. If this continues, Russia will collapse, one billionaire reportedly shouted. For ordinary Russians, fear mixed with defiance. Many began quietly protesting, despite the risk of arrest. The chant spread, no more war. The strike had not just been a military success, it had shaken the very foundations of Russia's political system. And as Ukraine watched from across the border, its soldiers whispered to each other, if one missile can shake Moscow, what will happen when the next wave comes?